So in this 1 hour presentation, Russell, Melanie, and Ankit will be sharing their insights on the following topics as it applies to divorce and income assessments. What is an income assessment? Different types of income assessments. Qualifications of expert income assessors. Is a CBV required? Cost of an assessment, how long do they take, and information required. Common adjustments to reported income. Spouses who attempt to shield income. Grossing up income. Critiques and common objections. And then Ankit and Melanie will be sharing their tips and tricks to finish off. And we'll also have a dedicated Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. So please, if you haven't already, please feel free to send in your questions via the Q&A box. Again, the chat has been disabled just to keep everyone anonymous, but you can send through the Q&A with any questions you have, and we'll do our best to get to those throughout the presentation. And just a quick note again, to please keep in mind that the content of this webinar is to provide you with general information, should not be considered as legal advice. And also just a note to those of you who are in the legal community that this program has been accredited by the Law Society of Ontario and contains 1 hour of professionalism content. And just on that note, all of our presentations from today, all of the 1 hour presentations have been accredited. So you can apply for your CPD hours for all of those. So now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce RussellAlexander, Melanie Russell, and Ankit Varma. First off, we have Melanie, who is the founder of Qualifications Incorporated, which she founded in 1996. Throughout her professional career, she has been involved in many assignments for a variety of public and private companies of various sizes and across many industries, obtaining her training at 2 of the largest international accounting firms in the industry. Melanie placed second in Canada on the CICBV membership examination, and Ms. Russell has been active in teaching business valuations and related topics since 1987 at various universities and professional organizations, and runs the premier preparatory course for CBV students in Canada taking their national membership qualification examination. Next, we have Ankit, and Ankit is a partner at Valuation Support Partners and has over 17 years of professional services firm experience. He provides business valuation and litigation support services to law firms, private and public companies, as well as individuals. Services include rendering of conclusions of value of business, intellectual property, and economic damages. He has completed numerous valuation and expert reports for various purposes, including matrimonial disputes, collaborative family law, commercial and shareholder disputes, breach of contract, share transactions, tax planning, corporate reorganization, among many others. And Ankit has participated as an expert in business valuation and income assessment at mediation, settlement conferences, and collaborative meetings for matrimonial separations. Next, we have Russell. If you're just joining us now, he is the founder and senior partner of RussellAlexander Collaborative Family Lawyers. With over 20 years of experience, Russell offers a wealth of knowledge and expertise in collaborative family law. He uses his experience with a client-focused approach by creating unique solutions for each of his clients to enable them and their families to move forward with their lives in a compassionate and collaborative manner. So I will now pass things over to you, Russ. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Great job, Shannon. Let's get the poll up and let's get rolling. We've got a lot to cover off. Please put your questions in the Q&A. We're going to go through the questions as we get them in. Also, please participate in the polls. It helps us understand who our audience is. This is sort of an introductory program. We also have an advanced session on this program that's available online if you've enjoyed this program. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Let's see what our audience is made up of today. Let's find out what the results are. All right, 78% law professional, 8% professional in another field, currently going through 9%, and a couple students and helping a loved one and others. So pretty much consistent throughout the day in terms of our audience. Thank you for participating. What is a business assessment? Ankit?
Sure. I think that's a good place to start.
Sorry, income assessment, yeah.
Yes, the income assessment. So the income assessment is governed by the federal child support guidelines. It is calculated in accordance with that. And What is important to remember throughout this presentation is we're looking at gross employment income equivalent. So the term gross employment is important. Typically, one would require an expert who may be recommended to be a chartered business valuator to do an assessment. It is needed when there is a business interest because there are benefits from business ownership that need to be taken into consideration and included in income that is available for support purposes. So generally, the process will start by looking at the individual's T1 personal income tax return. We're looking at line 15,000 of the tax return, and then we would make certain adjustments in accordance with the federal child support guidelines. So that is what is about, at a high level, that is what an income assessment is.
All right, thank you so much. There's different types of assessment, I assume, Melanie. What will we be looking at in terms of types of income assessments? What should people expect?
Sure, good question. So for anyone who's familiar with valuation reports, you might be thinking there's different types of income assessments. There's no formal levels of assurance that are provided or available as there are with valuation reports. So valuation reports, there's 3 levels of assurance, and income reports, there isn't really that. The real differentiation in terms of types of income assessment is how much work is done and what areas are drilled into. And I like to, I kind of use a comparison to peeling off the layers of the onion. So with an income assessment and an income analysis, an income determination, whatever you call them, you may just say, well, what's on the tax return as a starting point. And if it's someone who's employed by a third party employer, then that may be the end of it, assuming they don't have any complicated benefits or get options or RSUs. But if you have someone who's self-employed or someone who has some control or a trust or is getting money from property investments or other sources, then you may have to peel off a few more layers of the onion. So I would say that there are different types of income analyses based on the amount of work that's done and the extent of review that's undertaken.
Just like Shrek and the onion in the movie, that kind of onion, Melanie?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Got it.
And I suppose the more of the onion you peel away, probably the more expensive the assessment's going to be because it's going to take more time.
100%. And, if you can imagine the difference between someone who works for a bank and is lower level, not high level management, they get a certain dollar salary a year, they may get a few extra benefits as compared to someone who owns a business, controls that business, maybe there's a trust as well they're getting money from. You may have to go down for that person with a more complicated income structure. You may have to get down to looking at general ledgers, looking at invoices, contracts, statements, credit cards, bank account statements, things like that. So it can be infinitely more expensive as you drill down for a more complicated situation.
And we're going to get into this a little bit more, but I'm just thinking of my clients, right? And when you're doing an income assessment for a family file, oftentimes one person's pretty suspicious of the other person's income, right? Cash, business expenses, and we're going to get into that. But I could see how, especially if one person's not trusting of the other person for whatever reason, there could have been infidelity or it could create more work for the expert.
It can, and I think that's an excellent point and maybe feeds into the benefits of collaborative sometimes. But when you have information dyssynergies between the parties, or you have different levels of financial sophistication or different levels of knowledge, that can create challenges in terms of knowing what the extent of detail and level of review that's needed.
And it's a good practice tip for counsel when you're thinking about this. What how deep are we going to go in and what type of assessment am I going to need? So thank you for that, Melanie. All right, so let's take a look at qualifications. Ankit, what are you thinking here?
Sure. So taking those points forward, which Melanie was talking, in terms of costs, in terms of peeling the layers, there can be a lot of there can be a lot of work which needs to be done. So understanding what goes into the federal child support guidelines, understanding what is actually required is important. So you need someone who has experience in having done a lot of income assessments, who understands the adjustments, who understands how it is done. So it is helpful to have a qualified person who has an understanding of accounting, who has an understanding of taxation, who has an understanding of business valuation. So there are different areas and fields where there should be an understanding which the professional should have. It is recommended to have a certified business valuator do it. The way we have seen it, and we come across certain reports where we are critiquing them, I would say that more than 90% of the cases we've seen CBVs doing it. And I'd also like to mention that CBVs have been qualified as experts by the court in this area. So more often than not, one would notice a CBV do the income assessments.
What kind of education do you need to get for a CBV?
To do a CBV, one needs to have a good accounting knowledge, is what I would say. What one would notice that there are many CPA CAs who have done CBVs, so by default that accounting knowledge comes in. And then during the CBV course, there is a lot of analytics which is considered. So analyzing the financial statements, understanding the business, having a good understanding of the operations of different businesses as one goes along. It's important. So I would say having a good commercial background helps towards doing the qualification.
And I'm just going to, if I can add one thing in there,
Please.
just out of interest, there are some lawyers who are CBVs, funny enough. And the CBV exam, the MQE exam was written yesterday. And I had one student who was a lawyer, who was an M&A lawyer, not a family lawyer, but was going through to be a CBV as well.
Well, I think they're important too, because it goes to the credibility of the report, right? One of the areas somebody could get attacked in terms of their evidence or challenge would be the qualifications, right? And so I think it's essential you get a CBV involved, especially if, as counsel, you want to think, what am I using this report for? Right? Are we going to use it in a collaborative setting? Are we going to use it for trial? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But if I need this report as evidence at trial, then there's a whole set of rules and a whole set of requirements you're going to have to follow. And you got to be mindful, my expert's going to get challenged, right? What are the qualifications of this expert? Have they been accepted by other superior court judges to give evidence in their area of expertise? So these are questions you want to start asking at the very beginning if you're thinking about getting an income assessment. Great summary though, thank you. All right, so let's do a poll, because it's been a while before we've done a poll, and I want to get the audience's feedback. So let's throw our next poll up. What do you expect an income assessment to cost? So this is always a big question that I get from clients. And I guess this goes back to the idea of an onion. We kind of talked about this. But in terms of ranges, we're looking at 1 to 5,000, 5 to 10,000, 10,000, 25,000. Depends on the facts of the case, depends on counsel and if trial's required. So let's see what our audience thinks, and then we are going to do another quick poll, and then we're going to get into the answers of these questions. So clear majority depends on the facts of this case. We have a pretty sophisticated audience today. Usually these polls will trip people up. But looking at these results, I guess they're all correct, right? Depending on what the amount required and what the report's going to be used for. Do you two agree with that?
Yes, and I think you just took away our big discussion point.
No, I'm not taking it away. We're coming back to it. So let's go. Let's go. It depends. Stop saying, hey, you're not a lawyer. You're not allowed to say it depends. You're the expert. You're supposed to say, to this decimal point, this is what the result is. Okay. All right. One more poll, and then we're going to get into some more substance. how long does an income assessment take to complete? And this is another question lawyers are going to get from their clients, or even from the court, right? If the judge says, I require an income assessment, is your expert available? How long is it going to take to complete? So in terms of managing expectations, are we looking at a week, a month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year later? It'll be interesting to see what our audience comes up with, because we don't have it depends in this particular poll question. But we're going to see what our audience thinks, and then we're going to take a deep dive into these subject matters. All right, so 32% a month, 3 months, 51%, and then kind of spread out. So this is almost the perfect bell curve, these results. Okay, thank you everybody for answering the poll. Let's get into costs of the assessment. So Melanie, what are we looking at here? First of all, do you have any comments about the results? Let's get into what the costs are going to be.
Sure. I think the results were pretty bang on. I would have liked to see if you had number 7. It depends, and I'm
Well, everybody's going to be
guessing
picking depends. We're not
exactly. It wouldn't be a bell curve if that was on there.
That's right.
But it was a nice bell curve in poll 2 there. Costs of assessment, exactly, it totally depends. So my simple example of someone who gets a T4, has no properties, has no investment income. You probably don't need an income analysis for that person, and it wouldn't make any sense. But that would be very inexpensive, wouldn't take very long. Most of the time when you get Ankit or I involved, or you need to get us involved, it's because there are more complicated scenarios. So then you're getting into a little bit higher costs. So the cost can vary. I would think for most income analysis, when an expert is needed, it's not going to be $1,000. It may be, maybe 5, maybe more. So, but the key factors that go into that decision of, or the ultimate determination of the fees are going to be things like, how many years are you looking at? So we often start with 3, but sometimes the agreement is just to look at the most recent, especially if the separation is relatively recent. If you've got a retro claim, then you may be going many years back. So just the number of years is going to affect it. And then, of course, the complexity of the source, number and nature of the sources of the individual's income. How many companies are involved? What's the ownership of the companies? How do the companies decide how much income to distribute, whether it's management fees, bonus? Are there issues about reliability of the underlying financial information, which is a huge issue in my experience, and Ankit can comment on that. Maybe he's had a different experience, but often there's a concern about whether the financial statements and the financial information actually fairly represent what the owner, manager, and the support payer is receiving. So costs can vary significantly. How long they take can vary as well. I think the 3 months in my experience is probably more than, if it's very complicated, 3 months, yes. If it's less complicated, then no. But one of the, there's many factors that affect that. Some of the same ones I talked about that would affect the costs, but also if you're in a collaborative situation, that process may take less time. In theory, it should, than if you're working for one party, and especially the party that doesn't have easy access to the information. So the ability to access the information will affect the time and the costs. And I think not just, and even if you're working for the party that the expert's working for the party that has access to the information, sometimes there are concerns about the availability or the reliability of the underlying information, and you may have to go back to scratch or to do some additional work to get comfort on that. So that's a little bit of some of the points on the costs and how long they take.
Russell, you're on mute.
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Is there a theme, Melanie, where you see certain areas that are consistently cause delay I have some ideas, but I want to
I'm
see if
sure you do.
you see
I'm
it,
sure
you
you
see a
do.
pattern.
Yes, pattern for sure. And the patterns, you can go to the things that frequently come up are unrecorded benefits, or
Right.
benefits that are, if it's an owner manager, whether it's 100% or less than 100% shareholding, but whether they charge through as simple as the car without being T4'd for it, to more advanced schemes like funding the construction of a cottage through the business. There can often be a lot of those unreported. So that's one very, very common one.
That's a great idea.
Oh, sorry. Okay, this isn't being recorded, is it? I just keep
Maybe.
you're building a cottage now? Yeah.
No, but what I find recently is a lot of the expert reports get caught up with third-party delays, right? We're waiting on a third party to produce accounting records or disclosure. And that could pose a unique problem if you're in a collaborative setting, because there's no stick you can pick up. If you're in court, you can get an order that the person produce the information. But that can cause some delay too. You just get put on a list and the person's going to get to it whenever they get around to it.
Right. And if you think a great example of that is the accountants. The
Right.
wonderful
I didn't want
accountants.
to point them out, but yeah.
No, but they're wonderful, and they're not going to be biased. They're just there to provide the information in most cases, but they have busy seasons, and you always try to get to the accountant of the company or the accountant who prepares the tax returns for the clients. Get to them before, hopefully by the end of January, middle of February, but then don't expect any response between the middle of February and the end of April, and maybe even sometimes into May or June.
Yeah.
So you have to time it. So that's an excellent point, Russell.
It can be quite seasonal. Ankit, do you want to add to anything to this before we move on?
I agree with the points which Melanie is talking about costs. It can really vary a lot, definitely. And what's important is the level of depth which one requires and the amount of investigation one requires to be done. So, yeah. Yes.
All right, so let's get into common adjustments to reported income.
And Russell, I'm just going to add one more comment, if you don't mind.
Please.
I think one more thing that is, you asked for common themes. So we talked about the add backs, but also the attribution of pre-tax corporate income is another big issue that we'll get into later on. So another common theme.
So audience members, write that down. We're coming back to it. There's a quiz at the end. I'm just joking. Great point, though. Common adjustment to reported income. Ankit?
Oh, yes. So the first one which we see here is unreported income and cash. Now this can be a whole topic in itself for a whole hour or plus. And typically what we're trying to do is make adjustments to the reported line 15,000 income of an individual to come to a gross employment income equivalent. So the unreported income is any income which probably has been received in cash, and that needs to be added to the reported income. It is very difficult to understand how to uncover it. But having said that, it's important to have a discussion with both parties to understand if there is a possibility of unreported income and if this needs to be investigated. And typically, certain industries have a high level of cash transactions. It is not necessary that those companies do have it, but there is a higher frequency is what we've noticed. And without being biased towards anything, one would notice generally in the construction industry, or say certain contracting work, certain landscaping work, certain hair and beauty salons, HVAC contractors. So there are certain industries where one can see a pattern, and it needs to be brought to our knowledge before we go into it and investigate it.
Great tips. And, a lot of the ones I see is, cash, personal expenses being run through the business, double dipping. But you've got some tips, I think, Melanie, for things that lawyers often overlook in this area.
You guys never overlook anything. What do you mean?
Well, last time you told me we're always overlooking dividends, income splitting. Pre-tax income,
True.
right?
True. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these are common themes. And
Right.
obviously, Russell, you've probably seen a lot of these files. Not everyone may have. So if you're new to that income analysis or looking at income for support purposes, there are some common themes. So, the dividends and the income splitting often, and it can be to the spouse, to the parent. I've seen to the parents, to the kids, to aunts and uncles. It can be to many different sources. With the idea that presumably is not going to happen after separation, and that money should be available to the payer after separation. So also this concept of I don't know if you want to get into attribution of pre-tax corporate income is something that is, and Ankit can comment on this as well. My experience at the beginning when the child support guidelines came out is that most valuators just slapped 100% of the pre-tax corporate income in calculating someone's income for support purposes. But that was a long time ago, and it's kind of been modified, and the cases have helped us out to say, well, you got to look at it reasonably, that just because a company earns extra $100,000 that wasn't taken out by the shareholder, that doesn't mean that it's really available for support. So you've got to look at these different reasons. Is it actually available to pay out, or do you have to keep it in there because it's needed to keep cash on hand to pay the bills, or like this one, or you're saving to buy a building so you don't have to lease anymore.
Right.
Okay, that's not a good excuse, but for whatever.
A lot of these companies, especially the family-run companies, keep the cash in the company, right? All of a sudden they need the cash for other purposes. But just on the income splitting, it reminds me of a funny case. Husband was paying wife $60,000 just splitting income. She wasn't working in the business, right? And of course, they go through separation, and the wife points out, well, there's another $60,000 that you're paying me, and you're not accounting for it. And he goes, well, I'm paying my new girlfriend the $60,000.
And she's really working. But she is.
It doesn't quite work that way. So you're right. You got to ask the right questions, right? And what were they doing historically? And is this changing? Because the parties are separating, right? Where's that extra $60,000 going, and how are we going to account for it? So, all right, it's been a while. Let's get to another poll question. So we'll find out what our audience is thinking. And thank you so much for that input. And please put your Q&A into the Q&A box. We're going to try to answer as many as we can. Income assessments. What are the most common attempts to shield income? You've got a number that you've experienced. This is for our audience. We've got a number of choices there. And there was a question that came up I thought was pretty smart. They're all smart, but this one caught my eye. Would you retain a CBB to prepare for cross-examination? I think that's a fantastic idea because we don't speak the language. Sometimes we don't understand all the concepts. So have either you two been retained just to help counsel prepare for trial and cross-examine and take a look at somebody else's report? Ankit, you want to go first?
I've not seen many instances where we've been asked to do that, but definitely in a cross-examination, having an expert come in and present, it adds a lot of credibility to the whole process because we're working very independently and in an unbiased manner.
Yeah, or have somebody critique somebody else's report. Melanie, I guess this is common practice for you, or no?
Yeah, I would say more commonly you want to make sure that if an expert report has been produced, you want to produce an expert report that kind of matches that. I mean, you can, and I think that's a legal strategy as to whether the matching expert reports is better than just cross-examining the other expert, because I think you might take your chances if you don't have the expert report with cross-examination. So it's really up to the game. And I mean, if there's a number of simple issues or problems with the other expert's report, maybe cross-examination will work. But I mean, Russell, what do you think about that?
It can backfire, right? If you don't know the assumptions and the terms and how the expert's thinking. You could just enhance the expert's evidence by trying to cross-examine them, and it could really make counsel look unprepared unless you have some evidence that you're going to call on your own, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure if you guys testified at trial, you've seen that, right? And people kind of, lawyers and their clients kind of dig their own hole the further they take a run at the expert. And usually trial judges start to lose patience after a while, right? But that's been
And I think one, if I can add into this, that I think one of the other benefits to maybe having another expert report is that might lead to some settlement discussions, hot tubbing, as opposed to if you just, it's hard to do it otherwise unless you have two reports.
Right. It may end up saving you a trial, right? And a result that you don't like. That's a really good tip. Let's see what our audience is thinking. Keeping retained earnings in the company, 15%. So these are attempts to shield income. Cash, 36%. We had a question come in about taxis and their cash. Running personal expenses through a business, 34%. Now this is common, right? Most small businesses operate this way. It's not, we're not saying there's any criminality to it. It's just the way people operate, some of their lifestyles at times. But if you're going through a divorce, those need to be added back in and grossed up for taxes, and we'll talk about that. Third-party income splitting, 7%, using capital losses to reduce income, 6% other, and you can share in the Q&A. So thank you, everybody. What do you guys think of these results? Pretty consistent with what you're seeing?
I would say yes. Having these attempts to shield, yes, these seem to be pretty familiar. So essentially, I would say what the guidelines are doing is trying to uncover these attempts of shielding. So whether it be cash, we're trying to add it and adjust it. If they're running personal expenses, typically I'd say the business owners have the ability to take benefits beyond what a regular employee would be able to do so. So that is why we would probably add the personal expenses. And there would be certain categories of those personal expenses which are more frequently used by business owners. And then talking about income splitting with the spouse or say with the girlfriend, like you were talking earlier. So it's important to understand were there any economic services rendered and what are the economic rates for that? And accordingly, that needs to be adjusted and added back. So those all adjustments of related party compensation needs to be considered. And essentially that is what the guidelines are doing. They're trying to uncover all that is being shielded by the business owners.
Right. Melanie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think on just on its own, retaining income, in other words, building up retained earnings is not shielding income from support. It may be, but it isn't necessarily. So you have to look at the facts of the case. I'd also say with cash, you have to be careful because, and I've seen this many times, that just because someone earns cash doesn't mean it's not being reported, but it's a higher likelihood it's not being reported. But it also doesn't mean that it's not being used to pay expenses.
Right.
So you have to be careful when you're looking at both sides, because someone who's, construction business that's getting $10,000 in cash, they may be paying their employees in cash, or they may be paying some of their suppliers in cash.
Yeah, exactly. It depends on the industry too. It could be common, right? Just a quick question: from when there is shielding going on, and let's just say we want to uncover it, for lack of a better word. What are the most difficult things to prove or uncover when income's being shielded?
I would say the most difficult part is when there is just cash transactions. Then it becomes difficult, like taking the point of Melanie where the 10,000 is coming in as income and their expenses being paid out. Typically, we would not see any transaction trails. So then it becomes difficult to understand how that is functioning. Unless there are different purchase orders or the business owner is forthcoming enough to share information where they can support what they are discussing with us. So that is a difficult part. Having said that, typically whenever there is cash income, there would be a high utilization for it as well. So doing a lifestyle or a spending analysis may point or take us to that direction to understand what is the amount or the limit of cash which may be there.
Also, some of the evidence can come from the other spouse, right? We hear stories they kept $50,000 or $100,000 of cash in the safe or under the mattress or wherever they keep it. You know, they were funding vacations and lifestyles and dinners out with cash or gambling with cash. So the other spouse can provide some evidence, and then maybe, like you said, look at the lifestyle. Well, let's look at the passport. What countries have you been last few years? How did you pay for that particular trip? You know, show us the credit card statement or the bank account statement showing the money going out. So you have to be a bit of an investigator in that way. Any thoughts on this topic, Melanie?
Yeah, I'd say one of the most challenging things I see is poor record keeping, poor financial statements, poor wrong tax returns. And it's always becomes a huge conundrum because your starting point, as Ankit said, is supposed to be line 15,000, the tax return. Then if there's corporate interest, you look at those financial statements, underlying documents. But if you're starting with things that aren't, and I see this all the time, that just don't make any sense or aren't right, then you're almost having to build up what should have been there before you even get to the income analysis.
Right. And judges will get tuned into that, right? So if there's poor record keeping, and depending how the evidence plays out, there's a good chance you're going to get income imputed against you because your records are a defense as well, right? To a spouse suggesting that your income's higher and should be imputed. So if you choose to keep bad records, it could really come back to haunt you when it goes to having a judge decide credibility or use his or her discretion. But thank you for that. Grossing up. This is another important consideration when doing income analysis. Melanie, what do we need to know here? First of all, what is it, and what does our audience need to know?
The gross up for tax purposes is as Ankit mentioned at the beginning, what you're trying to do is equate someone to if they were earning a salary from an arm's length employer. So if they're getting certain benefits through by expensing things, by not reporting cash income and taking it and pocketing it, they're actually making something even more than what that cash income is. So the gross up is really trying to convert the benefits and the income to a pre-tax amount. Right. So if child support is calculated based on pre-tax income. So if I'm going to pocket $10,000 of cash, that $10,000 is probably worth, somewhere close to $20,000 if I'm at close to the highest margin and was tax bracket in Ontario and was earning just a basic salary from TD Bank, for example. So it's trying that tax shield is. Gross up is trying to equate it to a pre-tax equivalent amount effectively.
And that could be significant, right? If you have $100,000 in cash, the gross up's going to be, depending on your tax bracket, close to the same amount. Would that be right, Melanie? Yeah,
it'll actually be, for your highest, it's actually more than 53.53% is the highest marginal rate in Ontario. So it's more than double. And I always love talking to clients where it's like, the payor says, well, I've got benefits of about $10,000 a year and or $15,000, just add it in, who cares? I don't want to argue about it. And then I say, but that $15,000 is going to be convert to like 34, 35,000. They go, oh, that's a different story when you're more than doubling it.
But think about it. If you have a payer who says my income's $100,000, you find $100,000 in unreported income that needs to be grossed up. Now we're at $300,000, right? It gets high very quickly, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Absolutely.
I'd probably add a couple of more points to that.
Please.
When we extend the period to beyond a year, say 2 years or 3 years, and if the income is varying and if the cash amounts are varying, that range can be very large. So it becomes very difficult to say that should it be the amount for a particular year, or are we going to consider an average of a couple of years? Because there can be varying amounts of cash based on the economic cycle in which the particular company or the industry is.
And the larger the range, the more difficult it is to settle it, right? People run a trial on issues of whether your income's 100,000 or 300,000. If it's 30,000, there could be room for a deal. So it could have the opposite effect of actually requiring a judge to make an order if the difference is that much. Okay, we haven't done a poll question. Let's get our audience's feedback. Thank you, everybody who have been sending in your questions. What does our audience think the most common objections to income assessments are? And before we get to this, we've got a few questions. Let's see if we can get one. All right, so this one is a two-parter. If one of the parties in the family matter sets up a business after separation, the divorce is going, but the matter is still ongoing. Will the business income be considered in calculating spousal support for the other party? So I think if the support obligation is ongoing, it should be considered. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah, because it's usually supports, it depends on the timing, right? If the business set up 10 years later and unrelated to the marriage, and is it subject to equalization? Well, equalization is based on the date of separation. That's your valuation date. So I think that would be your answer there. Thank you for sending in the questions. So keep them coming, please. All right, so let's see what our audience thinks about common objections to these reports. Bias only collected data from one party, 14%. Pair does not have the income to pay support based on imputed income, 33%. That's an argument we hear in court all the time, right? Assessments did not properly account for all cash sales, 17%. Assessment did not properly account for personal expenses paid by a third party or a company, 13%. Gross up amounts to be added to income did not reflect income available by support pair. Well, again, quite a spread there. Ankit, what do you think of these results?
I think it's pretty fair, like all of them do come up, and it's difficult to say which one would come up more frequently. But definitely, like if looking at the first piece where we're talking about being biased, only data being collected from one party, it's important to understand that, is the expert being retained in a single capacity by one of the spouses, or it's being jointly retained? And typically, if they're jointly retained is when we would notice that we would involve the other party into the discussion and see if there's data to be provided. So that would probably help mitigate it to some extent. Again, it has its own pros and cons, the whole process of running a joint retainer setup. Talking about the second one, pair does not have the income to pay support basis. Yes, like those gross ups can really increase the income available for support purposes, and the parties may think that, okay, the payer may think it is notional, whereas actually that is the benefit pre-tax gross employment equivalent. So that is how the federal child support guidelines run, and one can do nothing much about that. Talking about assessment did not properly account for cash settlements. Yes, it all depends about the knowledge and awareness of the spouses, the amount of involvement one had in the business to understand the quantum of cash. So it can vary a lot. There can be casual conversations between spouses, which they may take and they keep quoting that. But then it is important to have some kind of support to establish how one looks at it. So typically, what I would say is like these are common, and while we're looking at it, or say we're looking at it from as another expert reviewing these reports, it's important to look at the assumptions and what is the foundation of those assumptions, the kind of supporting which has been relied upon, so that those quantifications can stand good should they be challenged.
Yeah, Melanie, you do a lot of testimony in trials and contested hearings regarding income assessments. What are some common objections that are put to you by counsel, or maybe even questions from the court?
Yeah, I think some of them that were outlined in the poll are good ones. The one about not being biased or not talking to their side, I think that's actually something I've sort of learned along the way, that even if it's not a joint retainer, I think it's a good idea to request to speak to the other party, especially so oftentimes that the other party, the spouse may have worked in the business and may have knowledge about what went on. So always a good idea. I think it's always a good idea. And I don't think a non-joint retainer should stop that from happening. I think the second poll about, geez, I don't have enough, I really don't earn this income that you're calculating, sometimes happens because of the gross ups, as Ankit was saying. It can also happen because you might have had a couple of good years and things aren't as good this year, so it doesn't look reasonable. And it can also happen because the payer just can't get their mind wrapped around that they make that much money. They don't think about how much they make, right? They don't really realize it, and they don't think of it in the terms, and they're used to seeing their tax return done every year by their accountant that says line 15,000 is this. How can I be making so much more than that? That doesn't make any sense. So sometimes it's a challenge for them to understand. And I think so I think the other areas that are common is in the poll, the personal expenses, not realizing them all. And that is challenging because if you're working for the payer spouse, you're relying on the information that you provided. And how far you dig. You could say, I'm going to dig, I want to see the invoices. And they'll say, well, I'm not paying you to look at the invoices. So you have to kind of balance that. But you also, as an expert, have to balance the materiality concept. So yeah, maybe I'm going to look through invoices. Maybe I'm going to find $4,000 more. Maybe it'll gross up to 8,000, but is that really going to turn the knob? I don't know.
Right.
Or I may find $1 million. I don't know.
But it's fodder for questioning, right? How far did you go?
Exactly.
Did you look at the invoices? Yeah, really great stuff. Thank you, both of you guys, for that. Let's get our next poll question up. We're going to do some tips and tricks and get into our Q&A. So when experts disagree to the appropriate level of income, the parties in the court should take one of the following steps. So give everybody a chance. Had an interesting question came in. Just want to make sure I try to get it right. On income tax returns, a business owner can deduct interest on loan payments, but not principal. For support purposes, it is appropriate to reduce income by the principal payment, given that those monies are expended and not available to pay other expenses. Kind of a complicated question. Anybody want to take a crack at that one?
Sure. I think if I can interpret that, I think maybe it's more if we spin it to property. So
Right.
someone borrows money to buy property and they deduct the interest, but should they also be able to deduct the principal payment on that? So that creates it's a great issue that I think, don't we get into in our next presentation about the double dipping?
All right, so there's a teaser. Okay, you guys, for the next one, we're gonna look into that question. That's a really good lead-in, actually, and it's going to be starting soon. So we will come back to that one. Thank you. All right, so let's see what our audience thinks. Take the highest number, 6%. Take the lowest number, 0. Meet in the middle, 29%. Ask the experts to hot tub and work at a. Use a dartboard, or let the judge decide. Well, hot tubbing, I think our audience is pretty sophisticated, is usually what the courts would direct the experts to do and see if they can meet in the middle. So excellent results there. Thank you. Tips and tricks. So we have a few minutes left, so we'll do 1 minute each. Ankit, you want to go first? Tips and tricks?
Sure, definitely. Talking about tips and tricks, it's important that both parties be forthcoming. It makes the process very efficient. They be open and honest to the extent it helps them in their purpose of appointing experts. They be reasonable. I understand that there at times is a lot of emotional agony, and rationality takes a backseat. But if rationality is there, the cost considerations can be under control. And it's helpful to be organized. That is what I would say.
Great stuff. Melanie, 1 minute?
Sure, 1 minute. Okay, a couple
Okay,
things.
we can give you a minute and a half.
Happy to, I'll do it fast. Consulting with an expert. So we talked about that at the beginning. I think that's an important thing. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to get an expert report or pay $20,000, but just consult with them and maybe get an idea. And especially one good example is when another expert has produced a report, send it off to an expert and just see if they think it's worthwhile looking at it. Are there any holes? Are there any issues? Is there anything that needs to be looked at in more detail? Another pointer, make sure you look behind the financial statements and the tax returns. There's often way more stuff going on, and you can't find out about it unless you dig a little bit deeper. Double counting, double dipping, which we'll get into, that's important. Looking, and don't be afraid to check bank statements, credit card statements, because that may be important to take a look at. But don't over rely on them. But don't forget about them. And really importantly, keep materiality in mind, and settling. If you try to settle, you can be more creative in your solutions, and mitigate issues with someone seeing that they have to write a check for X amount every year. You can be a little more creative. Was that a minute? Oh, you're on mute, Russell.
Thank you, both of you. Just like magic, Shannon shows up out of the meta universe and appears.
I'm back. Thank you, Melanie and Ankit, for sharing your knowledge on this topic. We really appreciate it. Just before we wrap things up and take a brief 15-minute break before their next discussion on divorce and business valuations, I'm just going to try and get in a couple questions from the audience that came in. So first up here, how does income assessment work for self-employment? What expenses are added back to income to show real income earned?
All right, who wants to take that one?
Okay, in terms of adding back adjustments, so typically for a business owner, one would notice that there are certain personal benefits which are taken, say their personal vehicle trips, personal travel trips, personal usage of telephone, personal usage of utilities. So it all needs to be understood that how much was actually for the business, how much is actually for personal purposes, and taking an understanding from the spouse, and if it's a joint retainer, from both spouses, and coming to an understanding on that. It just helps narrow down the issue upfront. So personal expenses is one of them. We've talked about unreported cash, a fair bit of discussion around it. We've talked about attribution of income, letting the money stay in the business even though it's not spent. But if it's available and if it's not required for, say, business capital expenditure, then that needs to be added. So these are different adjustments which need to be added and considered.
Think you had time for one more, Shannon?
Yeah, one more question. Thank you, Ankit. So last one here, what are some ways to identify undisclosed income, including ancestral property?
I'll take that, but I may have to get clarification on the ancestral part. But in terms of identifying undisclosed property, I think looking back to, well, first of all, is discussions with relevant parties, looking at bank statements, credit card statements, investment statements to see if there are holes that indicate something might have been purchased at some point. Maybe speaking to the accountant as well.
Great stuff.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And thank you again, Ankit. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope you can join us for our next presentation. We'll be coming back on at 3:15 after a brief break. We'll make sure you have some music while you wait. And we'll be returning, like I said, for a presentation on divorce and business valuations, again with Melanie and Ankit. So we're really looking forward to that.
Great job, everybody. We'll see you soon.